we can't have a generation of youth, 30% of them, who are addicted to nicotine and using e-cigarettes, and potentially going on to other products that we know cause cancer, heart disease, and are incredibly harmful. Literally kill 1 out of 3 people who use them as indicated, as in the case with cigarettes.
This is the James Cancer-Free World podcast. I'm Steve Wartenberg, and today my guest is Ted Wagener. Ted is the director of the Center for Tobacco Research, and he's also the co-leader of the Cancer Control Program here at the James. Ted's research focuses on how and why people smoke and strategies to get them to stop. And also, he studies tobacco regulatory science, which is the use of research and clinical trials to help determine the federal regulations that govern the use of tobacco products. We're also going to talk about electronic cigarettes, or e-cigs, and vaping, topics that have been in the news a lot lately. And all of these things are very important because tobacco use is the leading cause of cancer and cancer-related deaths. Welcome, Ted, to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Ted, let's start with a little bit of an overview on what you do, about what is the Center for Tobacco Research and the Cancer Control Program, and why are they important for fighting cancer?
Yeah, so I just came to Ohio State in June, and I was recruited here from Oklahoma, where I had helped start a center there as well, where I was recruiting faculty who, examine certain things in terms of tobacco research in order to prove the health of the state of Oklahoma. And so I was recruited here by Peter Shields to do something very similar. Now, Ohio State was very different from Oklahoma in the sense that here there's already a robust tobacco research program with many outstanding faculty who are nationally and internationally known for tobacco. Including
Peter Shields, who we've had on the podcast before.
Yes, no, for sure. But what my goal and kind of what I was brought here partially to do is to really bring everyone together on campus and to recruit additional tobacco researchers so that we can do even bigger things and also develop the #1 tobacco research program in the country.
You're actually building a physical center for the Center for Tobacco Research.
Yeah, we are. Just north of campus, we're going to have a floor in a building where we house 7 faculty members, but then also lab space. And we'll probably have the #1 human laboratory tobacco lab space in the country. We're actually going to have 6 negative pressure rooms. And by that, I mean it's rooms where we can bring people in to smoke cigarettes, hookah, tobacco, e-cigarettes, cigars, and measure their behavior live as opposed to just asking them about their behavior.
Wow, that's interesting. And that leads us into the next thing when you talk about tobacco research. I think that's a phrase and a whole area of study that a lot of people aren't familiar with. They sort of know, oh, yeah, well, tobacco nicotine causes cancer, but there's so much more to that.
Right.
So sort of fill us in on sort of some of the major areas of study that you and the team you're building are going to address.
Yeah. So, when you think about tobacco research, there's, as you mentioned, a number of areas. So there's obviously how people actually use these products. So there's behavioral research where we see where do they use it, why do they use it, what do certain groups use it more than another group, do certain groups use different products or use it in a different way than other groups.
This ties into the whole concept of addiction, right?
Exactly.
So why are people addicted?
Exactly. Why are people addicted? Why do they begin? We also look at the toxicological impacts of use. So we look at not only at the product level, so what toxicants do the products themselves have, but how does that then affect the body? We also have researchers and are recruiting more that look at how the tobacco industry markets and how we might be able to help the FDA and state and local governments develop regulations to reduce the impact of that marketing. And at the same time, from our end, develop media campaigns to reduce use, but to get the word out and really prevent people, especially youth and non-smokers, from ever starting, and also adults or youth who are already addicted, how to help them best quit. So marketing, we also do something called impact analysis, where we try to see, well, if we passed this regulation, could we model what we think the outcome would be for the state, for the nation, for the world? And so, we're currently recruiting economists and epidemiologists who do this work. And we have some folks here as well that do it. We also, in that group, we're very lucky. I think at Ohio State, we're the only tobacco center that has 2 lawyers. So we have
okay.
2 lawyers. Yeah, we have Micah Berman. We're very lucky. He's in the College of Law here, and Patty Zettler, who also is in the College of Law. And their areas of focus are in tobacco regulations and nicotine regulations, including pharmaceuticals. So incredibly lucky to have them, because as scientists, I can tell you, I can run a study that would show what will happen if we remove flavors from this tobacco product. Would people stop using it? Would they smoke it differently? Does it change, the health effects of the product? But I'm not the best person to talk to say, how do I then deliver and package this to a local government or state government or the FDA so that they can actually use that to pass effective regulation? So having those 2 is amazing.
Writing legislation
exactly
that meets legal standards.
Exactly. You don't want me writing. Yeah. I can't even understand it. But they're amazing at and very dedicated to it, and they care a lot about it. So it's outstanding that we have that, and very unique to Ohio State. The other area that we look at as well is in the area of cessation, because there is a lot of focus on regulation, but cessation's also important. We have a lot of people that are addicted to cigarettes, to smokeless tobacco, now to e-cigarettes, and oftentimes the people that are left still using tobacco products are those who are the most underserved in our country and in our state. And so
in terms of like socioeconomic issues.
Exactly. Because, they either have maybe some misconceptions about, what it would be to quit. They don't have the money to quit. They don't have the resources, or they're constantly in situations and in environments surrounded by tobacco products and people using tobacco that it almost seems impossible to quit. So trying to figure out what are the best means to help them quit, to help them be successful quitting.
Now, you just covered a lot of territory, which is great. That's a great overview of what you do, and it raises a lot of questions in my mind. The first one goes back to what you started with about addiction and behavior. So what is it about nicotine and cigarettes and other tobacco products that is just so addictive that just people cannot quit?
Yeah, the big addiction with obviously nicotine is an addictive chemical that gets to your brain very rapidly and releases a lot of chemicals that we enjoy, mostly dopamine. And so, cigarettes are incredibly addictive and very hard to stop using, obviously. And when you take a puff of a cigarette, they have some really neat studies, and some of which we conduct here, that show that after you puff on a cigarette, within 7 seconds, nicotine has reached your brain.
And it's like a jolt of something good.
It's a jolt, yeah. I mean, it's a stimulant that also, so it'll wake you up, but at the same time, it's also making you feel really good. And so when you start pairing that product and feeling good with, when you're working and you're stressed out, or you're hungry, or you're driving and thinking, you're essentially pairing a really good feeling caused by this product in all these situations of your life. It starts becoming associated with all those situations. And so whenever you're in that situation, you think about it and you want to use it. So we used to always ask people when we were doing smoking cessation work a long time ago, how often do you get a craving for a cigarette in the shower?
Wow.
Nobody gets a craving for a cigarette in the shower, because you're not really, if you're smoking in the shower, we got, but when they get in the car, they have a lot of cravings. After they have a meal, a lot of cravings. When they're drinking, have a lot of cravings. When they're stressed, a lot of cravings. That will make you feel better. And so you start seeing this learned pattern. So there's not only a chemical component of the nicotine, but also this learned behavior that you can control your dose of nicotine. You can control where you're using it and how you're using it. You even start liking the smell. Also, you really want to get in the weeds on that too. people. You start surrounding yourself with people who also smoke. You take smoke breaks. You can go outside.
There's a cluster of 10 or 12 people.
Yeah.
That's where they have to smoke. And
And you start seeing some of these things with like network analysis where you see, people who smoke are friends with other people who smoke. It makes sense. Like if you join CrossFit, I'm sure you start looking at your friend group. You start having more people that are doing CrossFit.
Yeah, if you do yoga, your friends are going to be yoga. If you're a cyclist, your friends are going to be cyclists. If you're a smoker, your friends will be smokers. And I take it the tobacco industry knew of this and took advantage of this. And as I think history and research and work you've done has shown, they secretly did things to make cigarettes more addictive and get more people to smoke.
Exactly right. Yeah, and so you see in the tobacco industry documents, you see how chemically they were trying to improve on the products to make them more addictive. But it's also interesting, a really clear example of how much they know comes with one of the first e-cigarettes that the tobacco industry ever started to bankroll, and it was blue. And it kind of gets at this social aspect where they sold blue e-cigarettes in this plastic pack. It almost looked, the box almost looked like an iPhone, but you'd pull it out of the plastic pack, and it was like a cigarette box, and you could charge your e-cigarette in that box. But here's the cool / interesting thing. Whenever that pack was around someone else that also had it, it would light up and vibrate so that you knew there was another e-cigarette user of that brand, like blue.
It had some sort of GPS tracker or something that could identify another.
Correct. And you could hold it. It had Bluetooth technology, and you could hold it. What they wanted people to do was, if they were in a club, and that's why it lit up, you could hold up your pack of your blue and so you could find each other. And so that shows you they understand your peer group, and finding others that are like you is really important to sustain behavior, right? You don't want to, if you're trying to quit, you don't want to still go out for that cigarette break every day with all your friends, right? That's probably not putting yourself in the best situation. If you're quitting.
Temptation.
Yeah, temptation. And so we know social support's important. It's important to help you start. It's important to help you stop.
How do you get people to stop? I mean, with something that's so addictive, what are some of the techniques and strategies that research has shown works?
Yeah. So there are effective strategies out there. I always start this off by giving people kind of the context for it. So each year, approximately 70 to 80% of people report that they want to quit smoking. So I have smokers, 70 to 80% want to quit. About 50%, about half of that group will actually make a quit attempt. But when you actually look at who quits for a period of longer than 6 months, it's less than 7%.
Wow.
So
it just shows how addictive it is.
It's incredibly addictive, and it's it's everywhere. So it's hard not to see it. And so things that can make that a little bit easier, and you'll actually double your chances of quitting, is by using the gold standard, which is counseling, and then combination nicotine replacement therapies. So usually like a patch, nicotine patch, and nicotine gum or nicotine lozenge. That's going to be your first line best bet. You can also, people are looking into the combination not only of counseling and nicotine replacement therapy, but also adding on to that smoking cessation medications like Chantix. So adding something like Chantix onto that as well, so that you essentially have these full combinations of different treatments to try to cover all aspects of what's going on. So the counseling, to work on reasons, situations, barriers to quitting. You still get your nicotine fix, but not in as much of an addictive way with the patch and the lozenge.
And then gradually you lower the amount of nicotine.
And then gradually you lower the amount. And then also your cessation medications to impact, different neurotransmitters in the brain to make you not crave it as much. Some people do want you off of nicotine forever, right? And that's up for debate, even in, especially in the research world. I'm someone who's more of a harm reductionist that thinks that I'm okay with you being on nicotine for the rest of your life as long as it's delivered
through a patch, and not through a
cigarette,
inhaling something
smoke.
Into,
yeah. And we get to the point where we talk about a lot in tobacco research about types of nicotine delivery. So a cleaner versus a really dirty fashion. Cigarettes are incredibly dirty. I mean, you're literally. But if you smoked a lettuce, that would be bad for you too. You'd be inhaling a lot of carcinogens as well. So cigarettes are the dirtiest. So anything combustible, cigarettes, cigars.
It's that heat and smoke that you inhale.
Exactly.
And cigarettes have all those other bad chemicals in them.
Correct. And then you look at that level of toxin exposure is reduced with products like even chewing tobacco. It's a little lower because you're not at least inhaling stuff, but you're still going to get cancer, head and neck cancer. But then you have products like e-cigarettes, which toxicologically speaking exposes the users to lower levels of those harmful toxicants. But then the best one would be nicotine replacement therapy, which exposes you to none.
Now, before we get into e-cigarettes, one more quick question before we take a break. You're a former smoker, which I found interesting. How and when did you quit?
So I smoked for about 7 years. I actually smoked a lot. I smoked a pack and a half a day of Marlboro Lights.
Now, I'm guessing from your age, perhaps, is that high school, college,
so
those 7 years?
It was college and into a couple of years post-college and into graduate school.
A pack and a half a day when you're stress of academia and grad school. Okay.
Yeah, no, and so I have a lot of firsthand knowledge of what it feels like and how much you enjoy it and how hard it is to quit. Now, I was in graduate school making $9,000 a year, so I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have a lot of money for. Nobody was giving me Chantix or anything like that. So
again, all the money you saved from not smoking.
Oh man, I know.
Apply to Chantix
exactly. And so it was actually my friend who we were outside smoking cigarettes in between going to one of our classes, and she was like, "Hey Ted, do you want to set a quit date?" And it's funny, right? Because this is your social support. I wasn't thinking about quitting, but she said it so without expectation. And that's important for therapy too later on. But, she said, "You want to set a quit date with me?" I was like, well, my wife has kind of told me I could keep. She understands how stressful graduate school is and everything. But yeah, I mean, when are we thinking? And she was like, October 24th. So it was October 24th, 2004. The end of that story is I quit. She started up 2 weeks later, didn't tell me, which was great. I found out actually like 3 months later. She's quit now. Okay. But I was glad she didn't tell me because the first week is tough, but it's amazing. And the addiction is strong enough that it's amazing. Even up to like 3 months, 6 months later, you'd see someone smoking and you're like, oh man, I could just run up to them and just suck the smoke out of their mouth. I know that sounds creepy and weird, but it is the addiction's strong. But by about a year, people can smoke right in front of you and it doesn't really even bug you all that much. And now when I see people smoking, it's not like I'm sitting there going, oh, I wonder what that would be like. It doesn't, you almost start feeling like a never smoker before.
Wow, and congratulations. You've just passed the 15-year mark. Right?
Exactly.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Ted, and we're going to dive down a little deeper into e-cigs and vaping and what Ted and others are discovering as we start to research these new nicotine inhalation devices.
A revolution in lung cancer treatment is happening at the James. We're proving lung cancer isn't solely defined by location and stage, but rather the individual molecules and genes that drive it. Simply put, there is no routine lung cancer. That's why our world-renowned specialists put their expertise towards treating one particular lung cancer, yours. At the James, we go beyond the routine to prevent, detect, treat, and cure your lung cancer. To learn more, call 1-800-293-5066.
We're back. And today our guest is Ted Wagener, the director of the Center for Tobacco Research and the co-leader of the Cancer Control Program here at the James. And we're going to talk about e-cigs and vaping now. And Ted, sort of give us a little bit of an overview on the rise and popularity of them and what they were at least marketed to do and what they really do and what you and other scientists and researchers are finding out about them.
Yeah, so I mean, the history of e-cigs is kind of interesting. The probably the quickest way to kind of explain it is they really started to come into the national picture around 2009, 2010. They were around before that, but around 2009, 2010, you really started seeing people use it and also researchers looking at it. And so early e-cigarettes were these products that looked like cigarettes, and we call those cig-alikes.
Cig-alikes. You called them that, or the industry did?
The researchers called them cig-alikes.
Cig-alikes. Okay.
Yep. And sometimes they're also called first generation e-cigarettes. What was interesting about those is they looked like a cigarette, and you saw that even when they didn't have nicotine in them, people would still reduce the amount of cigarettes that they would smoke for a period of time, about a week. But then over time, people just kind of went right back to smoking. There was a few people that could, really quit smoking using them, but not too many.
Because that's how they were introduced, as a smoking cessation device. They're marketed as a healthy alternative that would help you quit.
Yep. So from a regulatory standpoint, they wouldn't call them a smoking cessation device. What they would call them is what you said secondly, a smoking alternative.
Oh, okay.
So that was how they got around regulatory statutes, by saying that they weren't this is not a cessation device.
Oh, because that's regulated.
That's regulated.
But, okay.
Yep. So that's one side of FDA regulates medical pharmaceutical devices for smoking cessation with, essentially making a health claim. This was regulated by another part of FDA called the Center for Tobacco Products, which regulates consumer products that are recreational. And so they would just say as an alternative to smoking. But, there was a lot of subtext that, this could help you quit. This is safer for you. It's better than nicotine replacement products, those sorts of things. So those first cig-alike products that came out were really neat in what they were trying to do. But when you actually looked at why people weren't using them for very long, when we actually tested it, we saw that they didn't deliver nicotine very well. They actually delivered nicotine worse than a patch, which nicotine patch is very slow nicotine delivery. So,
people were craving nicotine.
They were craving nicotine.
And weren't getting it.
Yeah. And so if you could kind of picture almost like a graph in your head, if I were to smoke a cigarette at that kind of time zero, and I took 10 puffs, within 5 minutes, that line is going to spike way up. It's going to go really high to what we could say is 15 nanograms per milliliter of nicotine, so nicotine in your blood. When you look at what this e-cigarette was doing, it was getting to about 1.5 in about 19 minutes. So really, really slow. So
less nicotine, slower delivery.
Slower delivery. And when you talk about drugs, if you want something that's addictive, you want it to be high amounts of the drug and quick delivery.
So the industry, I'm sure, is going to find a way to deliver faster, stronger, quicker.
Exactly. Yeah, bigger, better, stronger, better. And what's also important to know, the tobacco industry, you think of like Altria, RJ Reynolds, they were actually not involved in the e-cigarette market at this time.
At the beginning, I do remember that.
Yeah.
But then they saw.
Right?
The profit potential.
Exactly. And so what you saw were hobbyists, people who were trying to quit smoking and were using these cig-alike products, but not finding them very satisfying. And so what they started to do, they realized, man, I look at this thing and I pull it apart. It's a battery with a heating element, and then it's just like a cup that essentially holds the nicotine against that heating element. And there's a wicking material in there to absorb the nicotine that you kind of wrap the heating element around. So there's really only a few parts. Could I make this myself? And they did.
Okay.
and so you saw at the same time, while there was a few companies out there, the big one was Joytech at the time, who was making these second generation e-cigarettes. These are the ones that we now see not too often, but were like the bigger pen or flashlight looking type devices. They were making one of those, but we saw hobbyists also making those. So essentially taking flashlight parts and creating their own e-cigarette, what we call a mechanical e-cigarette. So it didn't have like a computer chip or anything, and it was just mechanical. You put batteries and some wire and a Kanthal wire around like a cotton wick, and douse that thing in nicotine liquid, and you can push a button and make the electrical connection, it will make that wire glow and heat up, and you can vape. So those products did a little bit better of a job of delivering nicotine, and people are like, now this is a little better. And when we looked at the nicotine delivery data, again, we're always like 2-3 years behind, and it was actually one of our studies that looked at this first, we saw that it got about halfway to the nicotine delivery of a cigarette. So instead of reaching 15 nanograms per mil in 5 minutes, you're getting about 8 nanograms per mil in 5 minutes
compared to 1.5 to first generation.
Exactly.
So they're getting closer.
They're getting closer, and people were obviously you got people that tinker and they keep looking and they're like, well, at the end of the day, the way it looks as though we get a more satisfying product, because obviously they're not running pharmacokinetic studies, in their vape shop. They're like, I need to increase the power on this. It's like Tim the Toolman Taylor from like Home Improvement. You know what I mean? It's like, how can I get this to have more power? So they started using larger batteries, and then they started using thicker coil wire that you would wrap around that wick.
I feel like we're heading toward people hurting themselves.
Yes, you're exactly right.
Things catching fire and blowing up.
That's exactly where we're going.
Yeah.
And so these people weren't all electrical engineers, and so they started having batteries that had incredibly high voltages, and then this wire had very low resistance, so you created really, really high wattage or high power. Well, high wattage, high power means more heat. More heat means when you pour e-liquid over that hot coil, you get more vapor, more aerosol, which each one of those aerosol particles also has nicotine laced to it. So you start getting more and more nicotine. And so we have done studies now that show that those third generation products with the more power delivered cigarette-like levels of nicotine delivery, and actually we're getting up around 17 nanograms per milliliter in nicotine. And specifically what a lot of those papers showed is there's a direct relationship between the power of your device, the wattage of your device, meaning your wattage, and the nicotine delivery. So when it comes to e-cigarettes, the key factors for nicotine delivery are your wattage of your device and the nicotine concentration of your e-liquid. Those are two of the most important factors. There's other factors too, like the air hole. So when we were in vape shops in Oklahoma, we would see there'd be huge drill presses at the vape shop. And I'm like, what the heck? What's a drill press doing here? And they're like, oh man, you want to get huge clouds? Yeah, how you do that? You got to bore a hole through your tank. So you open up airflow. More airflow you can create, the more aerosol it creates, and it also makes it easier for you to inhale.
So the way they came from the manufacturer didn't have a big enough hole, so they had to drill them bigger to get it in faster.
Correct. And you had people who were making their own devices still with big Maglite flashlights now, and we called those products mechanical mods. They modified them, and they're mechanical, so there's no computer chip in there. So it's unregulated. They can make that thing have as much power as they want, and deliver as much nicotine as they want.
So now they were initially marketed as a healthier alternative to cigarettes. What are you finding out? Are they? And particularly recently, we're seeing people who have died. Right. So what is going on? Are they a healthier alternative?
So what's interesting is no e-cigarette is safe. And health is different from toxicological exposure. So no one knows really the long-term health implications of e-cigarettes, because that really does take some time. It would take 10, 20, even 30 years to really know the true long-term health implications. So what we look at to determine, to give ourselves the best guess as to what the health implications might be, we have to look at proxy markers of health. So we look at certain biomarkers or DNA damage and mutations, and look at certain levels of harmful carcinogenic constituents in your blood, looking at those sorts of things and seeing, are those more or less when you use e-cigarettes versus when you smoke cigarettes. And then we try to extrapolate based on that. And so what the research shows us is that for the most part, under most circumstances, e-cigarettes deliver far fewer harmful toxicants than cigarettes. And that is simply because there's no burning. There's heating, there's no burning. So there's no carbon monoxide present. And a lot of these combustion chemicals that are generated out of cigarettes aren't there with e-cigarettes. However, remember I was telling you more and more power gave you more and more nicotine.
Right.
But more and more power gives you more and more heat. At what point does heat become burning? So what they found out, these special situations is, with certain wattages, when you start getting higher and higher, you started to heat the e-liquid up hotter and hotter, and you start producing more and more of these bad chemicals.
So you're approximating a cigarette in terms of the heat that's...
So you're getting closer and closer. So, there's some of these studies that showed essentially formaldehyde levels in some e-cigarette aerosol that was higher than even what you would get in cigarette smoke. And a lot of that is from the flavors. So the flavors, when they break down through thermal degradation, they actually start producing high levels of formaldehyde at higher heating temperatures. And
formaldehyde, when heated up, has toxins in it that...
Formaldehyde on its own is carcinogenic. Okay. Yeah.
So that's why there's been all this debate lately about banning flavored e-cigs.
That's one of the reasons. The other is that flavors do not only appear to be attractive for adults, right? We all like stuff that tastes good, but kids also like things that taste good.
Right.
And, when you do look back at tobacco industry documents, you see, they looked at what are the products that are the easiest for kids to start. They're products that are flavored, have lower nicotine, and also have the nicotine's really palatable. And how they make that palatable is by changing some of the chemistry, specifically lowering the pH of the e-liquid.
So you're getting these 12, 14-year-olds hooked on nicotine, addicted
Correct.
to nicotine, and until they stop, they're going to crave it and need it and get it either on e-cigs or perhaps actual cigarettes.
Correct. And so, what's really interesting, because as I was talking there about the evolution of e-cigarettes from cigalikes to these pen styles to these big mechanical mods, which, by the way, the first time I ever went to a vape shop, the guy said, I want to show you something. We call these the AK-47 of e-cigarettes. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, it's all mechanical. We build these. There's no computer chip. So you could throw it in the dirt, bury it, throw it in the water, pull it up 10 years later, and it will still fire, just like an AK-47, and it delivers awesome nicotine. So those were the third generation. But then companies started creating these very high-powered devices. But then we saw this very quick shift in the market that's been happening over the last 3 years, and that's been with products like Juul, which are called pod mod or pod style devices. And they move away from having high power and instead have high levels of nicotine. So remember I said you can get good nicotine delivery with either high power or high nicotine concentration. What they're doing is they have a device that has very low power but very high nicotine concentrations in the e-liquid. Now the next question is, well, why didn't they do that from the start? The reason is the e-cigarette industry didn't know how you can make high doses of nicotine palatable because nicotine is an ingredient that's very harsh to taste and it burns your mouth. So what they did with these products like Juul specifically is they lowered the pH of the e-liquid, of the nicotine, by adding acid to the nicotine. And what that does is it creates instead of having freebase nicotine, you now have what's called a nicotine salt. The nicotine salt is not as bioavailable. And so it doesn't, if you just took straight nicotine, freebase nicotine, and inhaled it, most of it would absorb in your mouth, and that causes burning cessation. So people don't like that. But by changing the nicotine into a nicotine salt, they've lowered the pH, and now the nicotine's not as available, so it bypasses the mouth, and it doesn't burn, but it's a very high dose of nicotine that then goes right to your lung. And so now you have, by changing the form of nicotine, by making it which makes it incredibly palatable, you can now, instead of giving people 3 milligrams per milliliter of nicotine, which is essentially 0.3 nicotine, you can now have products that are 6% nicotine or 60 milligrams per milliliter of nicotine.
So we're going from 0.3 to 6.0.
Correct.
Wow.
And so now you can get a really good buzz without the throat hit, without having it burn. It's kind of like if they could find a way to give you grain alcohol, but have it go down as easy as like a wine cooler. Does that make sense?
Is there any negative side effects from this new technique to get the nicotine content higher?
The negative is you now have a product that's incredibly addictive to first-time users and very palatable. So someone who is who's naive to nicotine can inhale it and not have those kind of first, ooh, my mouth is burning. It's very easy for them to continue. Whereas in the past, it wasn't. All earlier e-cigarettes used freebase nicotine, and so it would burn. And so
instead of having to build up a liking for nicotine, it happens right away.
It happens right away. They do get the buzz. We do see in our studies with youth that they say, oh man, I do get a buzz like about 5-10 seconds later. Again, it's because of when nicotine actually reaches the brain. But they report liking the buzz, which makes sense. A lot of people like the buzz. It's usually the harshness that people didn't like in the past. But this now has created a whole class of products that essentially aren't harsh to use, but deliver psychoactive, addictive doses of nicotine. Now, the catch-22 with that is it's also a product that it's likely easier for smokers to switch, to quit smoking and go to this product because it's more palatable for them, delivers nicotine better than these other products, easier to use. So you have a product that's more addictive for youth, but it's more addictive for adults. Now, the other part of this is there's addiction, but then there's also toxicology. When you look at products like Juul and nicotine salts, and remember what I said earlier, increased power with e-cigarettes, so that increased heating is what created a lot of those harmful constituents. Now you have a product that doesn't have or require as much power. And to give you an idea, the power of a Juul is 9 times less than what you had with these big third-generation box mods. So, you're only at like 7 watts, whereas in these others you were having 60, 70. The highest wattage I ever saw on the device was 250 watts.
So the heat-related bad effects are reduced.
Are significantly reduced.
Which is a good thing.
Which is a great thing. And you also see that people, once you increase the amount of nicotine that's in that e-liquid, they don't have to take as many puffs on it in order to get the nicotine fix that they want. Why is that important? It's important because nicotine isn't the harmful thing in e-cigarettes. It's not the harmful thing in cigarettes. It's all the other stuff that's in there in the burning that makes it harmful. E-cigarettes, obviously, there's no burning, but all the other constituents that are in e-cigarettes, the flavorants, the other like vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol are in there. Those, when you heat them up, do create things that are toxicants. So the goal should be to have you take as few a number of puffs as you need to get your nicotine, but not anymore, because the other chemicals in there are what are going to hurt you and likely potentially down the road cause cancer or something else, or potentially heart disease. And so these products, by having high doses of nicotine per puff, means you don't have to inhale as many. So it's a real dilemma with researchers when you have a product, for example, like Juul or Pod Mod, that is very addictive, which means it's easier for smokers to switch to and quit smoking. Also has lower toxicants compared to other e-cigarettes, and definitely compared to cigarettes, but at the same time is addicting a significant number of youth. I mean, now it's up to nearly 30% of youth are using e-cigarettes, and that's crazy, and that's ridiculous and kind of unheard of. We're going in the wrong direction.
So, Ted, overall, are e-cigs a step forward, a benefit, or do the negative impact, particularly all the younger people doing them, is that a bad thing? Yeah,
obviously it's a bad thing. E-cigarettes right now, if we can't rein in youth use, I think it's a negative. especially since we're not seeing as high of numbers of adults as we thought we would quitting cigarettes and moving over to e-cigarettes. Most adult cigarette smokers who use e-cigarettes continue to use cigarettes, most dual use in that sense.
So it's not having the intended consequence
that we were hoping,
reducing smoking, and it's having the unintended consequence of more younger people taking up nicotine.
Correct. And so that's a big thing about our research, and what we're focusing on is there ways where products like e-cigarettes that we can create regulations that would protect youth while still leaving them there for adults, because they do have the potential to help and have helped a significant number of smokers quit smoking. There are a significant number of smokers that have quit smoking with e-cigarettes. And again, the toxicology studies show reduced exposure to these harmful chemicals. However, we can't have a generation of youth, 30% of them, who are addicted to nicotine and using e-cigarettes, then potentially going on to other products that we know cause cancer, heart disease, and are incredibly harmful. Literally kill 1 out of 3 people who use them as indicated, as in the case with cigarettes.
Wow, that's a fascinating dilemma that you and others in this field are going to be working on for years to come.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Well, thank you for filling us in on all these important topics and the importance and how hard it is to stop smoking and all the research that goes into it.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center, Arthur G. James Cancer Hospital, and Richard J. Solove Research Institute. For more information, check out our website, cancer.osu.edu.